Good morning, everyone. Just fine over the mic. So this morning, I wanted to talk a little bit about a koan that I've been working on lately. Uh, and I did email it around, so you've probably pretty much all seen. It's a passage from the Heart Sutra. It's actually a part of the Heart Sutra, which is a part of a much larger sutra. And because generally speaking, we don't have a lot of knowledge of where these things come from, I did a little research uh, into it to see like where the Heart Sutra came from, specifically how long it's been used, all that kind of stuff. And I didn't really know some of this information, and I've been chanting the Heart Sutra for over 50 over 50 years now. So I'll just fill you in on a little bit of the background information. So the Heart Sutra is a part or a fragment of the Prajnaparamita uh, Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, which is part of a whole group of sutras called the Prajnaparamita Sutra material or grouping or whatever. The original Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra is over 100,000 lines long in the original Sanskrit. And the Tibetans just call it 100,000. That's what they call it. It's part of the Tibetan canon. There's several volumes in the Tibetan canon, which consists of many, many books. And the material in the Prajnaparamita Sutra is represents what is often considered the second turning of the Dharma wheel, because it specifically forms the philosophical underpinnings for Mahayana Buddhism, and Zen grew out of the Mahayana tradition. I'm sorry, Dave. Can you grab me one of the sutra books? So the historical background of the Heart Sutra, which we chant, dates to roughly the 7th century AD. And it was originally translated into Chinese around between 602 and 660, evidently, by a particular monk who got the material from India. It doesn't indicate whether he traveled to India, but he probably did because he was considered like a pilgrim scholar. And he brought back some texts to China. This was one of them. But it's possible that just the Heart Sutra itself was used as in its short version that is used in Zen centers today as early as the 3rd century AD. Of course, the source material, the original entire sutra, has been around for much longer than that. But between the 7th and 8th century, the Heart Sutra, as the smaller text that we use, was distributed all over Asia, and ended up back in India, then China, Japan, Korea, and Tibet. So there's kind of four major, if you were to like distill it down, there's kind of four major aspects that the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra gets into, which also the small section that we chant is considered the heart of it, at least in the Zen school. Four major points that it addresses. One is emptiness, or shunyata. And we've talked about that a lot in various talks, various teachers have. But basically, the original meaning of shunyata was that things arise independently and are ultimately unborn. So, in some of my former talks, I've talked about Master Banke's teaching on the unborn mind. So that notion of the unborn And in the Sanskrit, the word for unborn is anutpata. And then the non-arising and illusory nature of all phenomena is the second major point that's discussed in this material. Um, it it really talks about the kind of dreamlike quality of what we call reality. And one of the things that I think we notice when we start meditating, getting into deeper states of meditation, is what we thought was reality wasn't really so real. And that kind of gets to the teaching that I wanted to focus on, or my own personal koan. But just quickly, um, it talks about how the reality that we normally regard as solid, that is the phenomena that make up our experience of life, are essentially uh, illusory phenomena. So just those two first things are pretty huge. And then the third point gets into, which is the prajnaparamita aspect, is the wisdom as being a kind of transcendence, that through understanding these teachings, that there's a kind of quality of mind that we develop, uh, and it's not a passive wisdom, but it's actually an active, discriminating awareness that we become kind of more in touch with. And when we do that, we begin to see things more as they really are, rather than the way we think they are. And this is also the sixth perfection of the six perfections, and I think a few people have spoken about that in the last year or so. Um, and then the last major point that the Prajnaparamita material gets into is that the Bodhisattva path. And the Bodhisattva path, I think Meredith spoke a little bit about this in his talk, excellent talk last week. Uh, the notion of the Bodhisattva path is different than the early Buddhist material, which speaks of the path of the Arhat, or the self-enlightened person. The Bodhisattva path speaks to relationship, and how, in order for us to really realize the teaching, it has to be done in relationship to helping others, um, cultivating wisdom while remaining in the world. There's a lot of ways of viewing that. In some traditional Buddhism, they speak about the notion that a bodhisattva, rather than being free of incarnation, chooses to incarnate into the human realm. And I don't know if there's any way to prove that, probably not, but it's an interesting idea anyway. Um, and also this bodhisattva path speaks to the notion of compassion and shunyata, or emptiness, being inseparable. In other words, that compassion arises out of emptiness, or out of the unborn, you might say. So hopefully that gives us all a little bit of background. Um, so the Heart Sutra, or what we call it in our chant book, the Heart of the Perfection of Great Wisdom Sutra. And that title is a better translation. It's an accurate translation of the Maha Prajnaparamita Sutra, which is the heart of the larger 100,000 line sutra. So this particular few lines, which I've been using as a koan lately, uh, goes like this. Thus, bodhisattvas live prajnaparamita, that's the wisdom mind, with no hindrance in the mind. No hindrance, therefore no fear. Far beyond deluded thoughts, this is nirvana. I'll read that again. Thus, bodhisattvas, and again, as I said before, this is unique teaching to this material from this time, what's often called the second turning of the Dharma wheel. The first being when the Buddhists taught, quite a ways before this came out. Um, Bodhisattvas live prajnaparamita with no hindrance in the mind. No hindrance in the mind. No hindrance, therefore no fear. Far beyond deluded thoughts, this is nirvana. And then it goes on, all past, present, and future Buddhas live this principle of wisdom or prajnaparamita and attain supreme perfect enlightenment. So it's a big statement here that and I think it's an accurate one in my experience that if we can understand and live this teaching of no hindrance in the mind, that then we do tend to drop fear, and that this is nirvana. And this is what's interesting about this is it's a very different notion of nirvana than was spoken about in the early material that the Theravadan school primarily uses, which speaks of nirvana as being some kind of a, I don't know what you'd call it, and I don't want to speak for all the Theravadan teachers, but it's almost like a disembodied state, or a state that's disconnected from the human experience, somehow beyond that. I think that many religions have that as the goal or as the kind of end result. In Mormonism, you get your own planet with all your wives on it. At least that was the original teaching. Um, and it's of course different in Christianity and different in Islam and Judaism, but generally speaking, the heaven states, or what we might call nirvana states, are not connected to the human realm. In fact, they're specifically taught as being different than and better, of course, than. And of course, that's what you aspire towards. But Buddhism, and specifically Zen, moves in a very different direction, a way more human direction. And that human direction is that the no hindrance of the mind happens in this very mind and body in this lifetime. And when we speak of the mind, the word mind in the Heart Sutra, we have to understand what I believe was the original meaning of it, which is the body mind, the body mind. So in other words, every psychological state we have has a corresponding sensation matrix or formation in the body, and vice versa, which essentially means they're not disconnected in any way, shape, or form. Now, we may not feel that, we may not experience it that way, but that's the fact of the matter. We know that because if we look at it carefully, we can see that that's the fact. So if we have a particular disturbing psychological event going on, if we're able to go into the body, we will experience what's going on in the body as a result of that, or maybe even as a consequence of it. They're so connected that we can't really say, whether which was the chicken and which is the egg. So then I've been looking recently at the notion of, well, what is a hindrance? What is a hindrance? And why are they saying that if we can eliminate hindrance in the mind, and again, we're talking about the body mind, that it results in no fear, and that this state of living in no fear is the state of nirvana. Now, the state of living in no fear doesn't mean we're not experiencing pain. We can still experience pain or discomfort or whatever's going on in the moment and not have fear as a result of that. In other words, we can just experience what is right in this moment. Doesn't have to generate fear, but it often does. It often does. And the funny thing about the human psychological process is we can be fearful of things that have already happened. We suffer a lot sometimes about things that have already occurred, or that things that we think have already occurred in a certain way. But again, according to this Mahaprajnaparamita material, it talks about the illusory quality of ephemera. So in other words, what we think is our past is ephemeral. It doesn't really exist. Our past doesn't exist. The only way our past exists is how we're holding trauma from our past in our body and mind still. And this goes to the hindrance, the notion of hindrance. So hindrance can mean a lot of things, I think, at a lot of different times and to a lot of different people. But ultimately, it's something that's in the way. A hindrance is something that's blocking us. What is it blocking us from? Well, according to the Heart Sutra, it's blocking us from nirvana, blocking us from nirvana. What is nirvana? Nirvana is living free of fear, as it defines it in the Heart Sutra. Again, doesn't mean free of pain. It means free of fear. It doesn't say free of pain here. It says free of fear. Free of fear about what's happened before, free of fear about what might happen or we think will happen or whatever, which again drives us back to the only thing that does actually exist, and that is the moment. And even the moment doesn't exist because by the time I speak about it, it's moved on to a different moment. We cannot grasp it. The mind of the past is ungraspable. The mind of the future is ungraspable. The mind of the present is also ungraspable. So what's left? What's left, if it's all ungraspable, is just experience, moment to moment, continually changing experience, interdependent experience. Someone also spoke about this recently too, the notion of interdependence. Interdependence essentially means that everything is connected to everything else. Nothing happens in a vacuum. You know, what we call karma is simply a lot of dependent origination occurring that we're experiencing in a given moment. Or at least we think we're experiencing it in a given moment. And again, even that's ephemeral. So I think there's a tendency sometimes for when people hear this kind of thing to think that it actually is divorcing us from life and relationships and all that. But it's just the opposite. When we actually fully experience that ephemerality, or is that a word, ephemerality? I don't know, the ephemeral quality of all things, and shunyata, or emptiness of all things, then what arises from that ultimately is compassion, gratitude, and wisdom. Compassion, gratitude, and wisdom. We can't even say exactly what the compassion, gratitude, and wisdom is based on. It just arises naturally. Now, there's exercises we can do to kind of try to develop this compassion, gratitude, and wisdom, and it's fine if that's what we need. But ultimately, it automatically springs out of experience of shunyata and the realization of the illusory quality of existence. So the practice that I've been doing is looking at whatever arises when I'm sitting and looking at it as, is this a hindrance? In other words, is it a hindrance or not? Now, because something is difficult doesn't mean it's necessarily a hindrance. If we're working with it, it could actually be something quite valuable because it shows us things. It has a teaching there. Likewise, when we do the like the Zen dialogue work or other parts work, we realize that all the parts of the self, including the parts that we least want to hear from, the ones we most want to stuff down and not hear from, that they all have a valuable teaching for us. And in other words, in the language that we use in the Zen dialogue method is we say each of them has a voice and that voice deserves to be heard. Now, it doesn't mean we have to live in accord with that particular voice. In other words, if the voice is the voice of fear that I had, that the 2.5 or 3-year-old Al had, it doesn't mean I have to be fearful now. But often I am fearful now when I'm triggered by something that happened when I was 2.5 because I'm not aware. I'm not aware that voice is even there because I haven't allowed it to speak. I haven't given it space to speak. And then the amazing thing is that when we approach what you might call hindrance in this kind of embracing way, then once it has a chance to express itself, once we realize it and allow it to come up, then there's this open space then that results from that shunyata dissolves kind of into the emptiness because it never really was anything solid. It was just something we were holding on to physically and psychologically. And of course, when we hold on to things physically, in other words, when we try and block things physically, it requires tremendous energy within the body and can create illness even. When one part of the self is battling with another part of the self, uh, it expends tremendous amount of energy and doesn't ever solve anything. That's the thing. It doesn't help when we're battling. There's a natural order that arises when we cease the internal battling to at least a substantial degree. And this is the practice as we keep working with whatever battling. This is the way I view it anyway. When parts of the self come in and are battling another part of the self, that is a hindrance. But they're both me. They're both me. So think of the absurdity of this, that we battle ourselves, and that's what creates hindrance. It's in the mind. It's not in just even in the mind, it's this body and mind. For my experience, it's this body and mind. It's not someone else's. So there's a tremendous amount of power personal power that can come out of the cessation of the inner conflict of different selves that are constantly at each other. And then when that begins to really calm and dissolve, then our true self really begins emerging, and then we can finally live in accord with the unborn mind and the true person of no rank, as I've spoken about before, and of course quoting Master Rinzai from 1,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years ago. So maybe I'll open it up now, but I just want to stress that how important it is that we use whatever we need to use in order to identify where the battles are occurring and then cease the battles at some point. Cease the battling. Because when we cease the battling, then the fear also metamorphosizes into something else, into spacious mind. So we don't deny whatever's going on, we work with it, but we also understand that we are creating it on some level. We're creating it on some level. We don't even have to understand specifically why or when we started creating it, but just getting in touch with the fact that it was created earlier, even that alone can really really help allay the fear. And of course, the zazen, the meditation that we do, is a very important tool, but depending on the particular person, we may need other tools also. I did. And the reason why I teach breath work and the dialogue work, in addition to the koan work and the zazen, is that I needed those tools to really get at a lot of what was going on for me. And so, we have to experiment to see whether if something's not working fully, then we might need to add something else to it. All right, so let's open it up now if anyone has any questions or comments about